Block 17 did not stand out from the other rows of weather-beaten barracks when the three soldiers were first pushed through its doors. In the late autumn of 1944, yet something in its silence felt heavier, darker, and more calculating than the rest of the camp. The structure was dim, its windows sealed with frost and grime, its interior thick, with a damp smell that clung to the skin and clothes of anyone forced inside. Thomas Bradley, John Miller, and Etienne Moraine entered it separately, each arriving after days of transport, disorientation, and brutal sorting procedures that stripped them of their ranks, identities, and any illusion of rescue. Though they did not yet know one another, each man carried the same haunted expression shared by prisoners who had already learned that this part of the camp housed those selected for something beyond forced labor. Rumors whispered in transit hinted at testing, at special units, at doors that opened only one way. And while none of the three understood the specifics, each sensed immediately that Block 17 was not a place for survival. It was a place where survival would be an anomaly. The interior of the barrack revealed rows of wooden bunks packed so tightly together they seemed to absorb every sound, every breath, every tremor of fear from the prisoners who occupied them. The men who had lived there longer had faces sharpened by malnutrition and sleeplessness, with eyes that flicked nervously toward the back room where the barred door remained locked except when opened by the guards. It was toward that door that newcomers were always pushed first, as if to be introduced to the building's true purpose. For the three soldiers, the first hours were spent adjusting to the sickly warmth produced by too many bodies and too little ventilation, the suffocating presence of a dread that seemed built into the walls themselves. They felt watched even when alone, monitored by a system that valued them only as objects of study. Each man tried to steady his mind, to summon memories of homes, families, and battalions. Yet already those images began to blur beneath the weight of the barracks' oppressive quiet. Their routines were quickly forced into a rigid rhythm designed to reduce the prisoners to subjects of observation rather than human beings. Days were measured not by sunlight. Little reached the interior but by the schedules imposed by the guards who collected groups of prisoners at irregular intervals, herding them to wardrooms within the block that no one returned from the same. The soldiers began to notice subtle but undeniable signs that the men brought back from these sessions moved differently, breathing shallowly, eyes reddened, bodies trembling with an internal strain they could not hide. Whispers in the upper bunks described experiments involving sealed chambers, strange vapors, and medical staff who recorded reactions with clinical indifference. Bradley, Miller, and Morin absorbed these fragments of information without speaking, each slowly realizing that the barrack was a testing site for substances no soldier was ever meant to encounter. Fear tightened around them like an invisible rope, drawing them closer to one another in silent understanding. The first night offered no rest, only a deeper plunge into the barrack's oppressive atmosphere. Prisoners coughed through the darkness, some with a rasp that suggested prolonged exposure to elements the newcomers had not yet faced. Others muttered in fevered half-sleep, calling out two ghosts of former lives, or pleading with unseen figures. At times, the barrack fell so still that every inhalation could be heard, amplifying the awareness that breath itself felt unsafe within those walls. The three soldiers lay awake for hours, each on a separate bunk, but connected by the same tightening sensation in their lungs, as though the air held a faint trace of something unnatural. It was then that the realization settled on them fully. The barrack was not simply a prison, but a laboratory disguised as one, deliberately fashioned to erode body and mind before the true experiments began. Morner arrived without the warmth or promise typically associated with daylight, because no light broke through the windows. Instead, the guards' boots announced the start of another cycle. Buckets of thin, lukewarm broth were distributed, barely enough to sustain a person even in normal conditions, and certainly not enough for men already weakened. As the prisoners swallowed what they could, the air grew taut with anticipation. Selections were made after these miserable meals. When the guards entered again and began pointing at individuals, each man stood rigid, hoping his name or number would not be called. On that first morning, the three soldiers were spared, though the relief they felt was short-lived as they were forced to watch others march toward the back room. Hours later, the same men returned, but looked shaken, their bodies listing slightly, their eyes unfocused. Something had been done to them, something invisible but heavy, like a toxin that lingered beneath the skin. By evening, the barracks atmosphere thickened further, as though absorbing the dread of the day. The returning prisoners lay on their bunks in labored silence, their breathing uneven, their movements stiff. No one dared ask what they had endured. Fear of being overheard silenced even the boldest among them. Still, Bradley, Miller, and Morin observed everything with mounting unease, their shared military instincts recognizing patterns of exposure, contamination, and physiological stress. The subtle but unmistakable odor that clung to the returning men, a chemical tang that burned faintly at the back of the throat, confirmed that the rumors were not exaggerations. The barrack was a site of chemical testing, and the three soldiers knew instinctively that their turn would come. As they passed, the oppressive rhythm of Block 17 carved itself into their minds, and the soldiers began to find each other through shared endurance rather than words. They exchanged brief glances of understanding, gestures of support, and rare moments of mutual steadiness in an environment designed to isolate and break them. Hunger, exhaustion, and uncertainty gnawed at their spirits, but something in each man recognized strength in the others, forming a fragile, unspoken alliance. That alliance would soon become critical, because Block 17 was not merely a place of suffering, it was a carefully controlled environment, engineered to escalate the exposure of prisoners to experimental gases. And as the sessions grew more frequent and the reactions more severe, the three soldiers began to realize they were being prepared for something far more dangerous than what they had already witnessed. When the guards finally called their numbers for the first time, the barracks seemed to fall silent in acknowledgement of a threshold crossed. Every step they took toward the back room felt like descending deeper into a realm from which there might be no return. The air near the chamber was colder, the floors cleaner, and the walls marked with chemical stains that no one had bothered to scrub fully. As the door closed behind them, the soldiers dimly understood that whatever happened next would mark the beginning of a new and far more terrifying chapter, one in which survival would depend not only on strength, but on willpower, unity, and the ability to endure what no soldier had ever been trained to face. The days in Block 17 began to blur into one another, forming a continuous stretch of dread in which each sunrise brought not relief, but the renewed certainty that something worse awaited them. Thomas, John, and Etienne had not yet been chosen for anything specific, yet they sensed it approaching, carried by the pattern of God's footsteps, the murmurs among other prisoners, and the strange metallic scent that sometimes drifted across the yard from a sealed brick building. Rumors about experiments had circulated in whispers, fragmented and confused, and although none of the men fully believed them at first, the anxiety embedded itself deeper than hunger or cold. The barracks themselves felt alive with fear, as if every wooden plank had absorbed the panic of hundreds before them. In that suffocating atmosphere, the three men strangers just weeks earlier gravitated toward one another, sharing silent company that felt safer than isolation. Their bond formed not through words but through the instinctive understanding that survival required more than endurance. It required witnesses who could confirm that they were still human. Their selection came without warning. One cold morning, guards stormed into the barracks with a purposefulness unlike the routine inspections, and the men inside stiffened as the soldiers scanned the rows with clipped efficiency. Thomas noticed the clipboard one guard held, its pages filled with numbers rather than names, reducing them to entries in a ledger whose meaning none of them could understand. When the three soldiers' numbers were called, they stepped forward not out of bravery, but because refusal meant immediate death, and the instinct to live still overpowered their terror. Outside, the winter air cut into their lungs, sharp and unforgiving, yet none of them dared shiver. The men were ordered into a narrow chamber with tiled walls that reflected the dim lights, making the room appear deceptively clean. The floor sloped toward a drain, and the moment they noticed it, a wave of dread washed through them with such force it made their knees weak. They understood then that the rumors had been true. Their minds scrambled to imagine what would happen next, but their thoughts fragmented under the weight of panic. In that suspended moment, every sound scrape of boots, the metallic click of a latch became amplified, carving itself into memory. When the door sealed behind them, the silence became unbearable. The three soldiers stood pressed against opposite walls, each trying to make himself smaller as though invisibility might offer protection. The first hiss of gas entering the chamber was barely audible, a gentle release almost too soft to be real. Yet within seconds the air shifted, a strange heaviness settled around them, carrying with it a faint yellowish tinge that made the room appear stained. Etienne's eyes watered first, not from emotion but from the chemical burn that felt as though invisible needles were piercing the soft tissue. Thomas tried to hold his breath, but instinct forced him to inhale, and the gas struck him like a physical blow. His lungs spasmed, his chest tightened, and an acidic fire spread downward with terrifying speed. John felt the same instant suffocation, a sensation so violent it drove him to his knees as he clawed at the air that now betrayed him. The minutes that followed were not minutes in the way time normally passed. They were stretches of agony that elongated thought and distorted reality. The gas seared their throats and nostrils, turning breath into a weapon against them. Their vision blurred, not into darkness, but into a pulsating haze of colors that made the room tilt and twist. Etienne's skin prickled as though thousands of tiny insects crawled beneath it, and Thomas felt a ringing in his ears that drowned out everything, even his own gasping. John's heartbeat pounded so violently he felt it through his fingertips, an erratic drum that seemed to echo across the chamber. Yet through all this suffering, none of them surrendered to panic entirely, because even in the chaos, they sensed that they had to stay conscious, had to remain aware, had to hold on to something that resembled thought. Eventually, as the gas dissipated, their bodies lay curled on the floor, trembling and slick with sweat despite the cold that seeped through the tiles. Breathing became possible again, though every inhalation felt as though their lungs had been scraped raw. The door opened, but the guards did not step in with urgency. Instead, they observed with clinical detachment, noting how long each man took to stand, how steady or unsteady their movements appeared, and whether any collapsed again upon standing. The trio, dazed and barely able to lift their heads, sensed that they were being watched, not as people, but as test subjects. When they were finally dragged out, their legs could not carry them, and for several minutes they were pulled more than they walked, their boots scraping along the floor. Back in the barracks, the other prisoners recoiled at the sight of them, not out of revulsion, but out of the terrible understanding of what had been done. The three soldiers looked as though they had aged years in a single morning, their faces gaunt, their eyes dull and red. They collapsed onto their bunks, their bodies still trembling involuntarily, and the room around them felt both too quiet and too crowded. The symptoms continued long after the experiment ended. Waves of nausea, bouts of uncontrollable coughing, and a deep, radiating ache in their chests that no rest could soothe. Their sleep became fragmented, filled with choking sensations that jolted them awake. The fear of another experiment loomed constantly, making even moments of rest feel stolen rather than earned. Over time, the physical pain settled into a grim predictability, but the psychological torment grew sharper. The knowledge that they had survived only to be used again carved a deeper wound than the gas itself. Thomas began to examine every detail of the camp the guards' routines, the medical staff's movements, the sound of certain doors opening, seeking a pattern that might warn them of the next selection. John, once the strongest among them, now moved with a heaviness that suggested each step carried the memory of suffocation. Etienne stared off and at the ceiling during the nights, as if trying to separate his mind from his body, distancing himself from the suffering he knew was unavoidable. Their friendship solidified not through shared words, but through the unspoken acknowledgement that they were witnesses to one another's endurance, and that such witnessing gave their suffering meaning. As the days progressed, the three men realized that the first experiment had not been the worst. Part it was the anticipation of the next one that consumed them. Every sound outside the barracks could signal their summons, and every morning could bring renewed torment. They learned to measure time by dread, not by daylight, and in doing so, the camp reshaped their internal perception of existence. The gas chamber was no longer just a place within the camp. It became a shadow that followed them everywhere, lingering in every breath and echoing in every heartbeat. the weight of which they carried with the quiet resolve of men who understood that they had become unwilling participants in horrors that the world beyond the barbed wire could scarcely imagine. The procedures in Block 17 began to shift in ways the prisoners could sense long before they could articulate them. The guards became quieter, more methodical, and the medical staff moved with a rehearsed indifference that suggested the experiments were entering a new phase. Thomas, John, and Etienne felt these changes not only in the rigid routines imposed on them, but in the heavy atmosphere that settled over the barracks, as though the very air had thickened with unspoken dread. Each day carried subtle alterations, new instruments on the tables, unfamiliar bottles arranged in orderly lines, and the stern faces of the technicians that betrayed a studied restraint. The men learned to read these signs with a grim intuition, sensing that whatever awaited them was designed to push the limits of human endurance even further. This deepening uncertainty gnawed at their minds, wearing down the fragile hope they had managed to preserve. The next stage of the procedures brought the prisoners into chambers that felt more confined, more meticulously controlled, and more suffocatingly silent. The walls were bare and smooth, with no hint of the outside world, creating the unnerving impression of being submerged in an environment constructed solely for observation. Thomas noticed how the technicians monitored their breathing with calculated interest, their notebooks filling with quick, precise strokes. John felt the subtle shifts in air pressure that made his ears ring long after the sessions ended, leaving him unsteady and disoriented. Etienne, though weakened, remained attuned to the faint mechanical hums that accompanied the experiments, sounds that suggested devices hidden behind walls or beneath floors. Their bodies reacted differently to each exposure, and though none could articulate exactly what was happening, all three sensed a deliberate escalation. Life outside the chambers provided no relief from the mounting tension. The barracks, once merely bleak, now felt like an antechamber to something far more ominous. Prisoners moved more slowly, not merely because their strength was fading, but because their spirits were being compressed under the constant threat of what the next morning might bring. The nights grew heavier, thick with the quiet breathing of men who no longer dared to hope, and the occasional tremors running through their ranks betrayed the nightmares they struggled to suppress. Thomas often found himself lying awake, counting breaths to force a rhythm into his thoughts, while John felt memories slipping away, replaced by an oppressive fog that settled after each session. Etienne clung to fragments of his past life. The taste of warm bread, the sounds of Parisian streets, yet even those recollections felt increasingly distant. Thomas's thoughts became fragmented, interrupted by intrusive flashes of the chambers and the suffocating sensation that lingered long after exposure. John experienced disorientation so profound that he sometimes felt detached from his own body, observing his movements with a chilling absence of emotion. Etienne fought to maintain a sense of self, but the relentless structure of camp life threatened to erode even the most deeply held memories. Despite the degrading conditions, the men's connection to one another strengthened in unexpected ways. They shared what little they could, fragments of stories, moments of silent endurance, and gestures of wordless encouragement. Their bond became a shield against the escalating horrors, offering a faint but vital reassurance that they were not facing the darkness alone. When one of them faltered, the others instinctively adjusted their pace, creating a rhythm that allowed them to move as a single unit rather than three isolated survivors. Their unity frustrated the psychological aims of their captors, who preferred subjects to be broken individually, bereft of connection or solidarity. In this quiet defiance, they found a fragile but persistent source of strength. The camp itself seemed to transform as winter approached, the cold sharpening every discomfort into a new form of torment. Frost crept through the barracks at night, settling on blankets so thin they offered little more than symbolic protection. The men's breath curled in pale clouds as they exhaled, each cloud a stark reminder of their fragile existence. Inspections became increasingly invasive, with guards scrutinizing the prisoners' faces and bodies for signs of deterioration useful for the experiments. The men understood that visible weakness did not grant mercy but instead attracted unwanted attention from the medical staff. They tried to stand straighter, walk firmly, and mask the tremors that ran through them. Though the effort drained what little energy they had left, Thomas practiced controlled breathing to steady his trembling hands. John forced himself to move with purpose, even when his vision blurred. Etienne bit the inside of his cheek to stay focused when waves of disorientation washed over him. Their performances were acts of survival, carefully calculated to avoid becoming subjects for even harsher tests. Yet the sense of impending catastrophe grew stronger as the days passed. The technicians began bringing new containers into the chambers, their unmarked labels and precise arrangements suggesting preparations for more advanced testing. Those who had survived earlier stages exchanged wary glances, their eyes reflecting a shared foreboding. The silence in the barracks deepened, heavy with unspoken fear and anticipation of what might come next. Even the guards seemed tense, their movements sharper and more mechanical, as if they too sensed a shift in the nature of the experiments. The air itself felt charged, carrying a subtle scent that none could identify but all instinctively distrusted. The winter of 1944 settled over the camp with a bitterness sharper than anything the prisoners had endured before. And for Thomas, John, and Etienne, the cold seemed to seep into their very bones, merging with the toxins that had already scarred their lungs. Each morning, the familiar rattle of keys and the heavy boots of the guards signaled another round of selections, another list of numbers called into the freezing air. Another group of trembling men shuffled toward Block 17 for the tests that had become the dark rhythm of their existence. The three soldiers had long stopped wondering why they were chosen repeatedly. Their bodies, weakened but still alive, had become useful instruments for comparison, and the doctors overseeing the experiments seemed intent on pushing them deeper into the boundary between endurance and collapse. As the days shortened and the wind carried the constant smell of burning from the crematoria, they realized that survival was no longer measured in weeks or even days, but in the minutes between each breath that scraped painfully against their damaged throats. Inside Block 17, the procedures evolved into something more methodical, more calculated. As the physicians refined their approach, the chamber grew colder and more oppressive, its metal walls reflecting the pupils of the victims like an infinite lattice of hollow, terrified eyes. The soldiers noticed that the doctors began introducing new mixtures, adjusting concentrations, observing how long a man remained standing, how long before unconsciousness set in, and how the body spasmed when deprived of clean air. Thomas felt his chest tighten with increasing speed each session, and John's coughing grew wet and deep, carrying flecks of gray that settled like dust on his clothing. Etienne, though leaner and more fragile than the others, somehow maintained a clarity in his gaze, as if he had accepted that each moment of pain etched a testimony that would outlive them all. Night offered no relief, as the walls of the barrack echoed with the labored breathing of hundreds of prisoners drifting uneasily between sleep and suffocation. The three soldiers lay close together on the wooden planks, sharing what little warmth their starving bodies could generate. Around them, men muttered prayers in languages from all corners of the continent, whispering names of wives, children, villages, and memories that felt more distant with every passing night. Death was a constant presence, slipping silently from one bunk to another, sometimes taking a man without waking the prisoner lying beside him, sometimes dragging out its arrival in slow, agonizing increments. Yet Thomas, John, and Etienne continued to hold on to consciousness, refusing to let their failing organs dictate the terms of their final hours in the camp. As the experiments intensified, the soldiers began experiencing disorienting side effects that blurred the line between waking and dreaming. Thomas sometimes felt as if he were floating outside his own body, watching himself stagger inside the chamber while the fog burned his throat from the inside. John developed periods of temporary blindness, where shadows melded into shapeless masses and the outlines of the guards. Faces became indistinguishable from the walls behind them. Etienne, though suffering, equally focused on observing the sequence of the procedures, counting the seconds between the release of gas and the onset of symptoms. Constructing a mental record, he hoped one day might be spoken aloud in a courtroom far from the barbed wire that caged him. The hallucinations, the trembling, and the vomiting became part of an unending cycle that consumed every waking hour and left them fearful of sleep, knowing that some prisoners simply never opened their eyes again. The guards, aware of the worsening conditions, grew more irritable and unpredictable, taking out their frustrations on the weakest men with blows delivered casually and without pause. The soldiers watched as prisoners collapsed during roll call, their bodies too frail to withstand the hours of standing still in the snow. And they witnessed how the camp's routine swallowed each body without acknowledgement, replacing a fallen man with another in an endless cycle of suffering. Even breathing the winter air grew difficult, as the smoke from the crematoria drifted across the camp like a toxic fog of its own, reminding the soldiers of the chamber they faced each week. Yet despite the environment collapsing around them, the three men clung to the fragile thread that bound them together, finding in their shared torment a sense of identity that the camp could not extinguish. By December, their bodies were nearly unrecognizable. Thomas's frame had shrunk into a skeletal outline, but his posture remained determined, as though defiance alone kept him upright. John's hands trembled constantly, and his skin had taken on a pale, almost translucent tone, but his jaw remained set with a rigid endurance. Etienne had grown quieter, conserving his energy with meticulous discipline, though his eyes still held a spark of intelligence that seemed to cut through the oppressive gloom of the barracks. Each of them understood that another round in the chamber could easily be the final one, yet as long as they could stand and breathe, no matter how shallowly, they refused to surrender. Near the end of the month, a final sequence of experiments marked the darkest point of their ordeal. The doctors increased the concentration of the gases, leaving prisoners gasping violently within minutes of exposure. The screams that erupted inside the chamber were muffled by the thick metal walls. Yet the soldiers felt every vibration through the ground beneath their feet. When their turn came, the three entered the chamber with the resigned steadiness of men who had seen every boundary of their own endurance tested. The gas hissed through the vents with a force that seemed almost impatient, filling the space with a haze so thick that visibility vanished within seconds. Thomas staggered first, clutching his chest as a searing pain ripped through him. John fought to remain upright, forcing every breath through lungs that no longer expanded fully. Etienne held onto the wall, refusing to fall, determined to witness every sensation, every cruelty, so that none of it would be lost to the silence the doctors expected. When the doors finally opened, the three soldiers collapsed onto the cold floor outside the chamber, surrounded by doctors scribbling notes, as though observing animals rather than human beings. The cold air stung their lungs, offering relief mixed with overwhelming agony, and their bodies convulsed from the violent shock of the gas leaving their systems. They were dragged back to the barracks, left among the dying and the dead, their survival more a failure of the experiment than a victory. Yet, as they lay on the wooden planks, trembling uncontrollably, something unspoken passed between them. The knowledge that enduring the final procedure meant that they had lived through the worst the camp could inflict. In the days that followed, all three existed in a fragile haze between consciousness and delirium. Their lungs burned with every breath, and their bodies trembled uncontrollably. But they forced themselves to eat scraps of bread and drink icy water whenever possible. Around them, rumors of advancing Allied forces spread in murmurs, passed from one bunk to another in cautious hope. Some prisoners believed liberation was near. Others feared the camp authorities would attempt to erase all evidence before help arrived. For the three soldiers, hope remained distant and indistinct. But the possibility that the world outside might still exist pushed them to fight for one more day. The final blow of winter came with a blizzard that swept across the camp, coating every surface in a thick layer of snow that glittered beneath the gray sky. Many prisoners did not survive the cold, their weakened bodies succumbing overnight. Yet Thomas, John, and Etienne endured Togbarelli, their bodies curled beneath threadbare blankets as they clung to the faint warmth of one another. They had survived the gas, the starvation, the brutality of the guards, and now the merciless cold tested them once more. In the depth of that storm, the camp felt suspended outside of time, as though the world beyond the fences had ceased to exist entirely. But the world had not forgotten them, and although they could not yet know it, the final days of their torment were drawing near. The darkness of Block 17, the experiments, the gas chambers, and the unending suffering were nearing their end. Yet the soldiers had no sense of relief, only the numb exhaustion of men who had endured too much to imagine another life. And as the winter night settled over the camp once more, the three shadows of Block 17 clung to breath, unaware that their survival in the chamber would soon become testimony before the world. The liberation of the camp did not arrive as a triumphant moment for the three soldiers, but rather as a surreal rupture in the nightmare they had come to accept as ordinary. When the gates were finally forced open by the advancing Allied forces, Tom, John, and Etienne were barely recognizable as the men they once had been, bearing the marks of prolonged exposure to the chemical agents that had ravaged their lungs, skin, and nervous systems. The medical teams who entered the barracks were struck not only by their condition but by the eerie calm with which the survivors met them, as if their instincts hesitated to trust even the sight of uniforms emblazoned with familiar insignia. Documentation teams moved through the camp recording evidence, measuring residues, collecting testimonies, and photographing the emaciated bodies left behind or clinging to life. The three soldiers were placed on stretchers and moved toward field hospitals, though each carried with him the weight of the dead who had shared Block 17 but never walked out of it. For the first time in many months, they breathed unpoisoned air. Yet every exhale came with a reminder of the irreversible damage left behind. Recovery, however, proved to be an uncertain word. Tom's respiratory system had suffered the deepest scarring, and breathing was a constant strain, as if every inhale scraped along raw wounds. John battled recurrent seizures and tremors, brought on by nerve agent exposure, and physicians struggled to stabilize him, unsure whether the effects would ever fully subside. Etienne's skin remained mottled and fragile, peeling unpredictably from chemical burns that had failed to heal in the barracks' filthy conditions. The soldiers spent weeks in military hospitals where teams attempted experimental treatments, none of which offered full relief. Medical officers interviewed them repeatedly, hoping to gather data on the gases. The Germans used data that could inform antidotes or future defenses. Yet every question forced them to revisit scenes they long wished to forget. The hissing of valves, the blinding cloud spreading beneath the doors, the bodies collapsing beside them in suffocating silence. Their testimonies became a crucial record, but each sentence extracted from them felt like reopening a wound the body was too frail to endure. When the war finally ended, the three survivors found themselves thrust into a world attempting to celebrate peace. While they carried permanent marks of the conflict's darkest machinery, Tom struggled to return to England, where industrial smoke and humid air often triggered violent coughing fits that left him bedridden for days. John lived in the United States under government medical supervision, with doctors tracking the neurological effects that rippled through him unpredictably, hindering his attempts to return to normal responsibilities or employment. Etienne returned to a France, rebuilding itself from ruins, where he became reliant on state disability programs while navigating social circles that were uneasy around the disfigured scars left on his neck and arms. They exchanged letters when they could, their handwriting shaky and uneven. Yet their bond grew stronger through the distance. Each man understood that only the others could comprehend the complexities of survival, the guilt of walking free while so many perished, the nightmares that surged unexpectedly, and the strange burden of being living. Evidence of atrocities others struggled to fathom. Their testimonies took on greater significance during the post-war tribunals, where prosecutors sought to expose the systematic brutality enacted within the camps. Courtrooms fell into chilling silence as medical officers detailed the chemicals used, the procedures performed, and the outcomes observed through the bodies of men like Tom, John, and Etienne. Their written statements were read aloud, describing how the experiments progressed from superficial irritation tests to full-scale gas exposure, conducted on weakened prisoners who had no defenses left. Photographs of Block 17, the cramped bunks, the sealed doors, and the containers of chemical agents were presented as evidence. The soldiers themselves appeared in court only briefly, as their health made extended travel impossible, but even their frail presence left a lasting impact. Observers noted how the defendants averted their eyes from these survivors, perhaps out of shame, arrogance, or the chilling recognition of what their actions had created. As decades passed, the three men became living symbols of endurance. Though they never embraced the role of heroes, they participated in interviews only when necessary, often preferring written contributions to avoid the strain of public appearances. Tom spent his later years advocating for veterans suffering from chemical exposure, hoping that their suffering would not be buried under political concerns or military secrecy. John contributed to neurological research programs, allowing scientists to study the long-term effects of the gases that had nearly killed him. Etienne devoted his time to memorial groups, assisting and documenting the names and faces of victims from the camp so that no one who died in Block 17 would be lost to anonymity. They lived quietly, avoiding the sensationalism that often surrounded survivors, knowing that the truth did not need embellishment. It carried its own power. In the final years of their lives, the three friends reunited once, an event arranged by veterans associations who recognized the historic significance of their bond. The meeting took place in a modest rehabilitation center in Switzerland, where all three were transported with special medical provisions. Fragile, worn, and bearing the cumulative effects of lifelong injuries, they spent several days together reflecting on the men they once, for the nightmare that tied them together and the unexpected strength that had allowed them to endure what countless others could not. Observers noted how they often sat in silence rather than conversation, sharing a wordless understanding that no outsider could ever replicate. Their final group photograph, taken in a sunlit garden overlooking the mountains, became a symbol of friendship born not from shared triumphs but from surviving the darkest chapters of human cruelty. When the last of the three passed away, historians marked the end of a living link to Block 17. Their diaries, letters, medical records, and tribunal testimonies became central pieces of archival collections dedicated to documenting war crimes and the human cost of chemical experimentation. Scholars emphasized how their bond demonstrated the resilience of solidarity, even in the most dehumanizing conditions. Memorial plaques were erected not only in honor of their survival but in recognition of those who did not escape the sealed barracks, whose names remained etched into camp registries and investigative files. The legacy of the three soldiers continued to influence war crime legislation, ethical medical practices, and international discussions on banned chemical agents. The story of Tom, John, and Etienne became a solemn reminder that survival is not merely a physical act, but an ongoing negotiation between memory, trauma, and the will to keep living. Their endurance illuminated the strength found in companionship, when all other structures of humanity had been stripped away. Though the world changed around them, the lessons of Block 17 persisted, etched into history, carried through generations of scholars, and embedded in the moral frameworks that guide modern warfare standards. In the end, their stories serve not as a tale of victory, but as a monument to resilience in the face of systematic cruelty. The three shadows of Block 17, as historians later called them, became eternal witnesses to a chapter humanity must never allow itself to repeat.